Well, if you've been following the 2026 budget closely, you'll know that government has placed the modernisation of South Africa's national payment system at the centre of its financial sector reforms. Through the Payments Ecosystem Modernization Program, or PEM, and the establishment of Pay Inc. as a national payments utility, the goal is to build open, interoperable digital payment rails that allow banks, fintechs and payment providers to move money faster, more securely and more inclusively across the economy. And that is exactly what we're unpacking today. Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast. Now, last week on this podcast, Marin Pandal of GoTime Bank helped us understand the plumbing, the legacy rails, the emergence of the rapid payments rail, and the promise of PayShap, and the significance of Treasury's decision to put real political weight behind payments modernisation through Pay Inc. and PEM. What came through clearly is that South Africa now has the foundations. The real question is what gets built on top of them, and how quickly adoption happens, and whether open infrastructure truly delivers the competitive, low-cost, inclusive digital economy that it promises. That's where today's conversation becomes especially interesting, because if GoTime Bank gave us the view from a digital-first bank, Ozo gives us the view from the merchant edge of the system, where payments either reduce friction, improve cash flow, and deepen formalization, or quite simply they don't. So today, we're really moving from architecture to application, and joining me to unpack that is Rachel Cowan, Interim CEO of Ozo. Rachel, welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast. Great to have you on. But firstly, just sum up your career journey so far and how you found yourself in South Africa at this position at Ozo.
Great. Yeah. Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me on the show. So, maybe you can hear from my voice, I'm not sure, but I have been in South Africa for 16 years, but originally from the UK. So born and bred. And I think I did a reverse trip where my husband and I found each other in the UK, and he was South African, or is South African. And we decided to do the journey back to the lovely Cape when my son was 2. So I have an accounting background. So I practiced and learned my trade in the UK. And my first job actually in South Africa was working in the tech space in digital advertising in a finance role. And then I gradually moved into the CFO space, and then over a number of career trajectory moves, I ended up in operations in Ozo 5 years ago, which was my first position in payments, and it was an incredibly steep and interesting learning curve, and that culminated in last year taking over the interim CEO role.
It's a fascinating journey for a number of reasons, not least of which we often think of the brain drain or professionals going the other way, going to London. It is something of a fintech capital, but your journey is very much the opposite of that. Building into this position as interim CEO at Ozo, what have you found about working in the South African, I'd almost call it the fintech startup ecosystem, is very much where Ozo finds itself playing. Certainly down in the Cape, there is something of a kind of Silicon Stellenbosch vibe to it, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. So, like I said, I arrived here kind of fresh-faced 16 years ago, and I think that was start of the boom almost of the sort of digital and technology space happening in Cape Town, and it really has just evolved. And I think it's a really exciting city to work in terms of the companies that are here. There's many that are setting up their headquarters. A lot of the banks obviously have their big HQs up in Joburg, with the exception of Capitec, who's obviously a force in the fintech space as well. And it's coming together quite nicely, I think, a really great melting pot of fintech and technology minds. And also it's a great place to attract talent. So, people want to work in Cape Town. So, yeah.
It's a small advantage over working in the city, London and the weather versus what you find in Cape Town. The lifestyle really is something else. Coming to Ozo, though, it was founded back in the mid-2010s, I think 2014-15, by Thomas Pays and Bradley Watrous. And initially, the company launched under the name iPay, then later Instant EFT, which back then really reflected its core product. When did you start working for Ozo?
So I joined Ozo mid 2021, and it was quite
Right.
a pivotal period for Ozo where we were just coming out of COVID. I mean, if we all remember that
Oh,
interesting period. And for Ozo, whilst I wasn't there, Ozo was actually on the sort of trajectory end of COVID where they really benefited because it was a huge boom in online and e-commerce payments, and they were able to facilitate that through our product. So we actually saw quite a significant growth in our business during COVID, and that culminated in sort of the end of 2021. We raised a significant Series B sum of $48 million. And that was really the start of our sort of trajectory here. Well, when I joined, and obviously deploying that capital and just ensuring that the business carried on growing and providing payment products for our merchants to ensure that our merchants can get paid easily and
yeah, yeah.
consumers can pay easily.
Now, if I recall through, and who wants to remember that COVID period? It did come up with some advantages, though, one of them being the fact that we realized we could pretty much work from everywhere. And I want to come back to that in terms of, how that's helped you from a talent acquisition and skills perspective, especially in Cape Town where there are lots of digital nomads. But before we get to that, that was the period, I think, when Ozo really went into its rebranding and scaling of its fintech infrastructure, wasn't it? When it changed the name to Ozo to form something that probably represented an evolution from a single payment product to this more broader digital payments platform. So where do you find yourself today as Ozo if you were to describe the evolution of the business?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I think Ozo started as a single payment method, so screen scraping. And we've now evolved into what we call a PSP, a payment service provider. So we are a core infrastructure and payment service provider to our merchants, and we can provide a number of products that enable them to receive payments from consumers in different formats. So we've got Pay by Bank, we've got PayShap, we've got card, we do vouchers, and we've recently launched Pay by Crypto. We also facilitate a payout. So we enable merchants to disperse funds to their consumers. So over the last 5 years, we've really cemented that full stack service that we can provide to our merchants. And we've also really grown our consumer brand. And we've actually got a really loved brand in South Africa that consumers actually choose to use, Ozo. So we've really grown over the last, 10 years, but particularly in the last 5 years to being a really well-loved and trusted payment service provider to our merchants in South Africa.
I think trusted is absolutely key in an economy where we still see up to 50% of transactions going through in cash, primarily in the township or informal economy. And, we'll come to that. But I think a major milestone through that was, and you mentioned it, to raising 48 million in Series B dollars, that is. So what was that? About 700 million at the time. Tencent, Endeavor Catalyst, very well-known names that. What was that funding primarily used to do for you to build into where you find yourself today?
So a number of deployments of capital. So one, obviously, into our infrastructure. In order to be able to service the volumes that we do, there had to be, a significant sort of rework of the platform to make sure that it was scalable and sustainable. A lot of product development that has gone in over the last number of years. All the products that I mentioned earlier, that comes with a considerable investment in terms of the architecture, the design of those products. A lot of capital deployed in terms of staff, bringing in talent, payments talent, technology talent. So a number of things. We looking to grow our merchant base. So it's a significant investment in our marketing and our branding. So but predominantly it's in the product and the platform.
Have you found, and to my earlier point, that since COVID and the ability to work remotely becoming so much more mainstream, that the ability to attract and really allure and entice the top talent to the firm has become a little easier prospect in terms of maybe casting your nets globally rather than just looking locally?
Yeah, definitely it's helped. Look, I think it's the talent fight is real. I think a lot of a lot of people in my position will say the same thing. So I think the broader that you can cast your net, the better. So we've got a number of people that work in different countries. Predominantly, we are a South African employer. I think that it's important to employ locally, and also understanding the South Africans' payment system is important. I think that sometimes some of the bringing people in externally from different countries, it's a steep learning curve because South Africa is not regulated the same as the UK, for example, that has a much freer sort of open banking framework. But yeah, predominantly any situation that can allow you to access talent and bring them into the business in an efficient way is definitely welcomed.
Coming to PayShap, which was, I think, another important milestone or development, certainly along that evolutionary journey. There was around 2023, there was a lot of excitement about the introduction of PayShap. Initially, we didn't quite see the uptake as one had hoped, and there was some concern around pricing and that kind of thing. You quickly positioned Ozo to leverage this new infrastructure. How did the real-time payments era feed into your broader strategy?
Yeah, so look, primarily Ozo is and has always been a bank-to-bank payment product. So that's where we started. And PayShap for us is really a culmination of where that type of product needs to go. And I think when PayShap was first introduced early in 2023, it was very much a peer-to-peer product that allowed consumers to send money instantly to each other. And I think that doesn't enable the uptake of the product as quickly as if you bring a merchant into that space. So what we did this year with PayShap requests, so that is the business element of PayShap. So that allows a business or a person to send a payment request to a consumer who then approves the payment instantly from their bank account.
Right.
So similar to receiving a payment link, but it connects directly to the bank account, and Ozo facilitates that via its integration with its merchants. So effectively that is the catalyst really, because that really brings the product to the public, and that will then allow adoption. And ideally what that does is we'll see a flywheel, and there'll be a consumer uptake and a take up, and more people will use PayShap as a way of transacting online.
Because for decades, just hearing you describe it, digital commerce was run on the rails of Visa and MasterCard. It really was this duopoly. Now with instant account-to-account payments through systems like PayShap, fintech companies like Ozo are effectively building this new checkout experience. Would you say we're witnessing the early stages of a structural shift away from card-dominated e-commerce towards account-to-account payments? And if so, in which sectors does that shift happen first?
Yeah, I absolutely think that. And I think that's a natural evolution when different rails come into an industry. So I think 100% we will see a shift towards a more commonality and an understanding in the industry that pay by bank is an acceptable way to pay. And I think it will firstly be e-commerce. So I think online e-commerce, and then it will shift to in-store. So working with Pay Inc. on their QR codes, there'll be adoption where you'll be able to actually pay for your grocery shopping, for example. You'll be able to pay in store if you're in a mall for your goods at checkout, because there'll be the ability and the product will allow for a speed of payment at point of sale. So I think there'll be very much a gradual shift. It is a momentum that needs to happen, and it needs fintechs like Ozo who have the distribution and the merchant relationships as well as the consumer brand to be able to ensure that there's uptake in those products.
In payments, there's always been this battle, the strategic battle over who controls that moment of checkout. Is it the bank? Is it the card network? Is it the gateway, the fintech layer? Do you think in a world where we are opening those payment rails and you've got real-time settlement, that the real power really shifts to whoever controls the checkout experience rather than whoever holds the bank account?
Yeah, definitely. I think you see in Europe between the Stripes and the Adyens and the PayPals, the battle is for the checkout experience, and that definitely brings with it additional information such as data and the layer and the settlements. So yeah, 100%. I think the checkout is powerful. Owning the checkout is powerful.
And last week on the podcast, Maren Kundal of GoTime suggested that payments are gradually shifting from a profit center to an enabling layer of the economy. If that happens, if payments ultimately trend towards zero marginal cost, well, the commercial opportunities clearly got to lie elsewhere. Where do you think that lies? Does the future lie in charging more for, I don't know, the data in those transactions or adding on services? Where do you see the real commercial opportunity?
Yeah, so I think it's well known and versed in payments that everyone says it's a race to the bottom. Look, I still think it's a race to the bottom, maybe for everyone but the banks. I still think there'll be a layer, a charge, and there will still be money to be made from payments, but it won't necessarily be as significant or as high a margin, and you'll have to push through more volumes. I definitely think that the sort of value added services in terms of, like you mentioned, data is going to come into it, as well as providing, even things like the settlements for merchants. So, it's really important for a merchant to receive their money quickly. And often that doesn't happen in the way that the system is set up at the moment. So there's definitely opportunity in providing the ability for payments to enable merchants as well to run their businesses better. And that will enforce innovation, which is actually what you want in a modern economy.
How do we get to that space where we can clear for merchants almost in real time? And it builds on, again, something that we touched on last week with Maren around the fact that until we see full interoperability, a lot of this still remains just a promise and not really something that's going to change the game in practice. So where do you think the gap still lies between that promise of payment modernization and that lived reality of digital payments in South Africa?
Yeah, look, I think we're taking a really good step with the payment modernization program that will essentially allow fintechs such as Ozo access into the national payment system in a way that it hasn't had before. So the constraints potentially of operating with sponsor partners don't exist in the same way. And that will allow for a level of innovation that hasn't been seen previously. So I think any form of modernization of existing regulation will automatically allow for innovation. I think whether it succeeds or not is how well it's executed.
Absolutely. Execution, again, is one of the keys. I mean, you sit at a very interesting intersection in this whole conversation. So what does Ozo see that banks perhaps don't? Because you sit at that point of sale and the checkout friction. And how different does the system look when you design it from merchant checkout backwards rather than from the banking core outwards?
Yeah, no, 100%. Look, I think the way everyone succeeds is actually working together. So I think it's a misconception that fintech is disruptor that needs to go out on its own as a lone ranger. So I think when you can bring a strength of a bank and a fintech and the shared infrastructure providers such as Pay Inc. together, you get a solution that is going to solve for problems. And I think ultimately payments are a problem for merchants and they need to be solved, just like any other business problem. And for us, we look at it at the lens from the merchant. So the merchant's experience and the consumer experience. I think we've all got to remember that all of our merchants spend significant amount of their capital and their budget on acquiring customers. To lose those customers at the checkout is a waste and is something that we as a payment service provider want to avoid. So coming at it from the lens of merchant experience and consumer experience and making that seamless and fast and intuitive and working with a bank and a Pay Inc. is only going to strengthen the payment infrastructure and the payment solutions that we can give merchants in South Africa.
Would you say the main stumbling block to further uptake is now more on the demand side in terms of educating merchants, or would you say it's still a Rails problem or a technical problem? Where do we go from here to see greater adoption, I guess, is my question.
So for PayShap, it's a very sort of broader solution, I think. So one, there's definite consumer education. So the consumers need to know that PayShap is safe. There's a lot of work that's being done around fraud. I mean, obviously, when you have an instant payment solution, your fraud controls and your compliance around the transactions have to be very, very thorough and robust. And I think that, along with merchant education, and a merchant experience. So a merchant has to be comfortable that the payment method that a consumer is using is going to succeed, and the completion rates or the success rates must be high. So we, as a PSP or a business deeply entrenched in payments, is working with Pay Inc. and the banks to ensure that that PayShap experience is good enough for consumers to adopt it and for merchants to obviously want to provide the payment method. So it's not a one solution for everyone. I think it's where we all come together as an industry, the fintechs who are working with the merchants, ensuring that the banks know that their consumers trust the solution and trust who provides the solution, and then obviously the regulatory framework. And I think if we can all come together, we will see adoption, and it will be, like I said earlier, it will be a flywheel effect. The more that it becomes normalized and the consumers are aware of it, the more it will be used or just continue. So it's just in that awkward growing up phase, I think.
What kind of lessons have you learned? Because Ozo has been early in integrating PayShap request for e-commerce, and last week we talked a lot about instant payments in the abstract, but the e-commerce setting gives it a very real practical commercial use case. So what, firstly, problem does PayShap request solve at checkout that existing payment methods don't solve well enough? And what is your experience and learning been through integrating PayShap request?
So look, PayShap should be a much more cost-effective solution. So the costs of PayShap from Pay Inc., downstream is very different to existing EFT frameworks. So ultimately, the consumers should benefit from that because the merchant should pay less for the product, and that should be passed on to the consumers. And the consumers also should be very aware of what a PayShap payment costs them. So that's obviously something that is being discussed at industry level at the moment. So I think from our side, the adoption of PayShap should provide, obviously faster payments, and it should be more inclusive, and it's obviously interoperable as well. And, we have implemented many bank-to-bank payments, and, we understand the pitfalls of what that can be. And a lot of it can be managed through robust fraud controls and educating your consumers and your merchants.
Absolutely. What do merchants actually care about? I mean, you're sitting there, you chat to them daily. What do they care about when it comes to payments? Do they just want speed and cost, or are they looking for checkout conversion? What is it that really would move the needle or the dial for merchant priorities?
Yeah, so look, merchants want a payment to complete. So they want to know that if a consumer clicks on a payment method, there is a 100% chance that they will go through with that payment. And then once they've gone through with that payment, the merchant wants to make sure that they get that money quickly. And it should be cost effective. And I think it's one of those products that startup businesses, for example, maybe don't even know that they have to pay for payments. So I think there's an element from a merchant's perspective of payments being a bit of a grudge purchase. So which is why when someone like Ozo comes along, if we can make sure that the experience is top notch, that it will complete, the merchant will get their money, the statuses and the information that we share is correct, the reconciliation files are correct, and the whole support experience, then it doesn't become a grudge purchase and it becomes an enabler to completing a transaction and getting something over the line for that merchant.
Right. And last week, we had discussed a few useful kind of micro examples. A roadside coffee seller who can restock the same day if payments settle instantly. Let's take that a level further. Where do you see the biggest SME benefit from modern payment systems? Is it maybe better cash flow or credit visibility? Where do you see the big game changer for the broader, if we're to zoom out, SME economy?
I think for the microeconomy, the street vendors, the access to cash becomes crucial. And if we can settle them quicker, instantly, then that's really a game changer for their business, because we see a lot of those businesses being constrained by access to capital. And if there's more visibility in the transactions that are going through, so for example, if they use a method like PayShap and it's digital, there's more access to information around how that business is trading, which can help them gain some credit. It's obviously sensible credit that can help their business grow. And often when you're in a cash-based economy, those things are much harder to come by and the cost of borrowing is much higher.
Just lastly, Rachel, as we are sadly reaching the end of our time, what's important for us to focus on now broadly as an industry, or from you as the industry? What are you looking for from the regulator to ensure that we don't allow this momentum to slip? Given how much time and focus was dedicated to this area in the budget, it does seem to have the requisite political backing.
Yeah, I would just say that as long as it continues with the momentum and there's a clear focus on it from the regulators, we will definitely see payments becoming faster, cheaper, and interoperable, which will ultimately benefit consumers and merchants and the entire economy. So I think it's just important to make sure that momentum remains, which we are seeing that in the industry and on the ground.
Rachel Cowan, thank you so much, Interim CEO of Ozo, for sharing your insights into what is no longer the dumb pipes of the economy, probably one of the most exciting spaces in finance that we've got at the moment. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Well, over these past two episodes, I think what has become crystal clear is that South Africa is no longer just talking about modernizing payments in theory. The foundations are certainly being laid in earnest. Last week, Marion Kundal of GoTime Bank helped us understand the architecture and the shift from legacy rails and closed systems towards a far more open, interoperable model, backed this time by something that's often been missing in South Africa, genuine political will. And this week, Rachel Cowan of Ozo brought that story down to street level, to the merchant checkout, the SME cash flow cycle, and the real commercial edge, where instant payments either make life easier, cheaper, and faster, or they simply don't get adopted. I think taken together, the message is quite simply this. Pay Inc. and the Payments Ecosystem Modernization Program aren't just about faster transactions. They're about really rewiring the incentives and the access points and ultimately the competitive logic of financial services in South Africa. Well, if you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to like and subscribe and to join us next week for more on the Monocle Banking Podcast.